Welcome to the Dynamics Downloads Project and Distribution Enhancements webinar. Just to look at the agenda, today we're going to look at an overview of what needs these enhancements address and what specifically you can do now that you were previously unable to do. We'll then walk through a demonstration that will give you some examples of how these features can be used in real life. We'll also review the features with a little more detail, and then we'll go over some of the setup requirements that are required to use these new features. Now, we all know that for years Microsoft Dynamics SL has had a very strong set of modules for project-oriented businesses and a very strong set of distribution modules for businesses that sell goods to customers. And there have always been integrations between project and distribution, but to be honest, there was a lot left to be desired. So in project, you could enter your time and expenses and process through flexible billings and invoice your customers. And in order management, you could take new orders from those customers and process shipments. In the purchasing module, you could process receipts for inventory items, but of course they would either need to immediately be expensed to the project or received in inventory. Once received into inventory, there was no way to allocate those quantities to projects while leaving the commitment on the project. Companies that sell or distribute to install their products could not automatically create projects when the customer order was placed. They weren't able to keep inventory on hand in their inventory system, but yet allocated to the project associated with the receipt. They were unable to invoice time and expenses along with inventory items on the same invoice. Obviously, that can cause problems. And just looking at some of those needs, these are companies that have long-term projects. They have a need to start a project as soon as the order is placed. They have projects that not only include labor and expenses, but also have inventory that would need to be billed for. They need to reserve on-hand inventory for specific projects and keep those commitments intact, but not expense them to the project until the items are actually used. They may have the need to invoice their customers for inventory and time and expense on the same invoice, or maybe not even the same invoice, but the same invoice format. Or maybe they don't want to invoice for their material at all if they're using milestone or percent complete billing. So to address these needs, Microsoft Dynamics SL has a new purchase for type in the purchasing module called Goods for Project Inventory. Using this purchase for type will allow you to receive quantity into stock while remaining earmarked for the project associated with the purchase order. There's also a new screen in the inventory module that will allow you to allocate as well as unallocate existing on-hand quantities directly to specific projects. You now have the ability to auto-create your projects when a sales order is entered in the order management module. Shippers from order management can now be invoiced in the flexible billings module, or you can turn off the invoicing feature for order management shippers to bill a project on a percent complete or milestone basis. And along with that, there's also some enhancements that provide an audit trail between the modules. So we're just going to jump over and look at a quick demonstration of how these new features are used in real-life scenarios. So hopefully everyone can see that we should be a screen that shows improving allocating, recording, and invoicing of material. So we're going to look at a company called Contoso, which you may be familiar with. And Contoso provides custom audio and video equipment to companies all over the country. Each sale also requires installation services. Timeliness is important when setting up projects so that all material and labor expenses can be allocated, recorded, and invoiced. And it just so happens that Contoso is using Microsoft Dynamics SL to meet those needs. And they're using the project module, the inventory modules, and of course the order management modules. Now Prakash, this guy over here is Prakash. Prakash is a project manager at Contoso. He's telling Susan, who's over here, Susan's in sales. He tells Susan that there's too long of a delay between the time when an order is placed and when a project manager sets up the project. That delay can cause problems in assigning resources, scheduling installations, and it could possibly result in not meeting the customer's expectations. That delay can also cause missed revenue when there's time spent on the project but isn't recorded because that project hasn't been set up yet. So Susan and Prakash agree that the project should be created as quickly as possible. So Susan opens up the Microsoft Dynamics SL sales order entry screen, and on the other information tab she's able to now create a project directly from the sales order. Now this populates the project ID with the project template that's specified on the particular order type that's being used in the sales order screen. Now once we add our inventory items to the sales order, we see that the project ID defaults into the sales order screen. Now this is the project template that's defaulting. So once we save the sales order, we'll see that the project is updated with the next available project. And that project is actually created right now as soon as that sales order is saved. So we can go over to project maintenance and see that sure enough, there's our project. It's been created and is ready to be used. So going back to the order management module, in the order type screen, we can see that we'll go ahead and select our sales order, order type, and we can see that here is where the default template project is specified. And not only that, but the new project status. So once that project gets created, what status do you want that to have? So Prakash's next issue is around his inventory. He has a little chat with Alicia, who's in purchasing, and he discusses an inventory issue that he's experiencing. He notes that oftentimes the items that he's ordered for his project are taken for other projects or orders. I know, you're saying that couldn't be, that doesn't happen in real life, but it does, I assure you. So for example, in sourcing materials for past customer projects, he's bought speakers, video monitors, and cabling, and after those items were received, some of his other coworkers decided that they might use those products for their customer orders or maybe another project before he had a chance to actually allocate them to his project. So it's important to Prakash that not only can he see the commitments, but he wants to also make sure that others don't use his purchased items for other purposes. And along comes the new purchase for type, goods for project inventory. This is going to allow you to allocate the items and their costs to the project. And you can do this by entering a specific project and task on the purchase order. Once the items are received, they're going to be designated as inventory items intended to only fill orders for the specified project. So I'll save that. So now we have a purchase order number 11. So over in inventory, we can see that the quantities of each item that is allocated will show up here in a new demand field called Inventory Allocated to Projects. And we have a drill down button here that will open up the Inventory Allocated to Projects inquiry screen. And this screen allows you to enter your selection criteria. And in this case, we're just looking at the inventory ID. So this is going to show us everywhere in the system where this inventory ID is allocated to any project. So we can see that there's currently 2 projects that this item is allocated to. And not only that, we can go further and see that, well, yeah, the details here, the purchase order, we can see that that's our receipt. We can drill into the activity for that specific allocation. So we can see when that initial allocation was made. And as that would be issued to the project, you'd see that in the detail as well. So by using the Goods for Project inventory, Prakash has a lot more control over his material, and he's going to be able to ensure that the customers receive the agreed upon items and that the items are available and delivered on time. But what happens when things don't go exactly the way they're intended to go? Well, we'll look at that as soon as I show you the sales order. This was the sales order for that receipt that we just looked at. And we can see that if we look at the shipments, there's our shipper. So it did create the shipper. And now our customer is going to receive their items on time as agreed upon. So as I was saying, sometimes things happen and last-minute changes are needed. So in this case, we find out that the installers got there and they realized they needed more than 4. They needed an additional 4 monitors to install at this particular location. Well, Susan sees that the sales order quantity has changed, and she recognizes that that could cause a delay. So what Susan does is jump into action, and she goes to the project inventory allocation screen. She selects her item. She clicks the project inventory button, and this shows her the projects that are currently, or the receipts that are currently allocated to various projects for this item. And she's doing this because Contoso tries to keep the stock of these particular items to a minimum. So Susan wants to check with the other project managers to see if maybe they have some unused items that that Prakash could use on his project. So she uses the fancy new Grid to Excel feature, and she emails that to the other project managers to ask if there are any allocations that aren't needed. And sure enough, she hears back from one of the project managers that he happens to have an extra 4 monitors. What a coincidence, because that's exactly the number that Prakash needed for his project. It's almost like we made this up, but it's true. So she's able to take the 4 that were allocated to project XX0003, and she can unallocate them from that project and then reallocate them to Prakash's project. And so the sales order amount was fulfilled and the project continues with no delays in equipment delivery. Hooray. Yay, yay, yay. So the next thing we're going to look at is that in the past, bills for goods and invoices for labor were delivered as separate documents, and that sometimes would confuse customers because they would expect one consolidated bill, and it also made it very hard to do milestone billings because those invoices from order management would automatically process. So we can see now that a new setting on the project maintenance screen gives you control over when and where the shipper invoice is processed. So we can see that there are three options. You can invoice it in order management like you always have. You can invoice it in project flexible billings, or you can tell it to not create an invoice. Okay. That's right. Okay, got a little hung up there for a second. Not sure. Sorry about that. So now we can see that when an invoice is generated, not sure what the hang up here is. Oh, well, sorry about that. It helps if you open the right screen. So the invoice and adjustment maintenance screen allows us to see that not only is the labor being invoiced, but we also see our video monitor there, right in there with the labor. And we can then go to the invoice print. And when we print those invoices, we can see that we've got our labor, our cost of sales, all on the same invoice, making our customers very happy. And that is the demo. So let's jump back to the PowerPoint. Hopefully everyone sees the PowerPoint again. And we'll start digging into this a little bit deeper. So again, I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the purchase for type of goods for project. That purchase for type allows you to create commitments on the project, and then once the PO is received, the commitment is removed and the expense hits the project. However, the inventory module is not affected by those transactions. So with the new purchase for type, goods for project inventory, the commitments on the project remain and the inventory is received into stock. However, it's allocated specifically to that project. So sales orders with the specified project can and will use that inventory. Once the inventory is issued to the project, the commitment is relieved and it becomes an expense to the project. Now there's also another purchase for type that I didn't mention before, and that's the goods for project sales order. And that allows you to link a goods for project inventory purchase order to a sales order that has been tied to a project, giving you the ability to link specifically that sales order to a specific purchase order. Other than the linking between the PO and the sales order, the purchase for type behaves the same way as the goods for project inventory. So it just will tie that sales order specifically to that receipt. Whereas if you have a sales order tied to a project that doesn't have a linked purchase order and items are received in an inventory that aren't allocated to that project, if there aren't any other items allocated to that project and there's just the quantity available, that sales order would consume that inventory and process the shipper. Whereas if you tie it specifically using the goods for project sales order, it's going to wait for that receipt to process the shipper. I hope that makes sense. Maybe that'll generate some questions. So there are some requirements to get that functionality to work, and one of them is that the issues account needs to be tied to an account category. Without that, you're going to run into problems when you try to process batches for items that have been allocated to projects. Now, as we saw in the demo, there's a new demand field called Inventory Allocated to Projects. There's also an inquiry button that allows you to drill down into the Inventory Allocated to Projects inquiry screen. So from there, we can choose any of the selection criteria to see all of the projects that a given item is allocated to. Or maybe we want to see how many items are allocated to a specific project. Once you enter the selection criteria, whatever it may be, and refresh the screen, you're able to click on the detail line to see exactly what activity has been done to that allocation. Again, the project inventory allocation screen, there we're able to allocate and unallocate items to and from projects. Something to keep in mind is that the allocation and unallocation of inventory does not create records in the INTran table. There are two new tables called INProjAllocDoc and INProjAllocTran that keep track of the project allocations. It's also important to note that the reference number will need to be a unique number when processing transactions through this screen, which is tough for us support people that are used to just throwing any number. I use 12 in every transaction when I'm testing, so that has to be a unique number now, so it's a little bit different. So we saw in the sales order screen that a task was also defaulting into the detail line of the sales order. On the Item Defaults tab of the Inventory Items screen, there's a new field there to enter a default task to ensure that transactions are hitting the correct task. If you decide not to populate that, that's not a required field, so you could leave that blank. If it is blank and you create a sales order for that inventory item, that just means that you're going to have to manually populate the task ID on the sales order detail line. In the Issues screen, you'll now notice that the project and task fields are there, and you're able to use the Issues screen to issue the allocations to projects, causing the commitments to be removed and the expense to be entered. And just a quick review of the ability to create the project from the sales order. The project is generated based on the template project ID coming from the order type screen. You can only specify one project per order/shipper header. So you can only have one project ID per order shipper combination. The default project status and default project template are kept on the order type screen. And as we saw, the inventory items can be set up to have a default task. And this is just a graphic to show exactly where you find that default project ID and the default status. And again, your options there are either active or planned for that new project status. And when a new sales order is entered, clicking on the Create Project field will populate the project ID with the default template. It doesn't mean you must always use that template, as you can F3 in that field and it'll show you all available projects that can be selected to use as a template. So how does SL know which projects can be used as templates? Well, that's a great question. And we'll see that on the next slide. the very next slide. So the template projects have the same required fields as the regular project, but one thing you see here that is different is that the status flag is set to template. I'm going to just point that out. That is any project that has a project controller status of template is going to appear in the PV window when you're in the sales order screen. In the project template, you can specify 3 different methods to invoice. If you want it to work the way it's always worked, you would leave the option set to invoice and order management. If you'd like the ability to combine material along with labor and other expenses, choose to invoice in project flexible billings. If you're using milestone or percent complete, you would want to you wouldn't want to invoice the order management material at all. However, keep in mind that the costs for those shippers would still hit the project. Once the project is created by the sales order, you can come into the project maintenance screen and update it with any required or desired additional information. Maybe there's a specific allocation method or rate table that you'd be using, and these and other fields can be updated once the project has been created. So it's just going to create the default project based on your template, but from there you can modify it to meet the specific needs of that project. And we'll just take another look at that fantastic invoice that shows not only the labor but also the inventory. And finally, the last thing I wanted to show you is that with the new fields added to PJ-TRAN EX and PJ-INV debt, you can now track the transaction back to the originating records in order management, because you can now see the shipper ID and shipper line ref for each transaction processed to a project. Very cool. So some troubleshooting pointers. So after watching this webinar, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be so fired up about these cool new features that you're just going to go out there and want to test this right away, maybe in your demo database. Anticipating that excitement, I put together a couple pointers just to give you a heads up on a few things that I found as I was started using these features. The first is that you might find that the Create Project checkbox is disabled in the sales order screen. And there's 3 possible causes for that. The first and most obvious is that you don't have the project controller set up. Obviously, if you're not using project controller, it's probably going to be tough to create a project. The next, which may not be so obvious, is that you can't auto-create a project if the work order module is installed. So if you've got work order, you can't use that feature. And finally, you may not have sufficient access rights to create a project in the project maintenance screen. These are the same access rights that the sales order screen is looking for. You may also notice that the shipper invoice option is disabled in the sales order screen. That's because it's informational only in the sales order screen and can only be changed in the project maintenance screen, which is where we saw that option enabled. Once you get to the project, you may find that it's also disabled in the project maintenance screen. And that would be because billing rules in flexible billings are required for the project in order to change that setting. And finally, you might notice that the Create Invoiced Draft option is disabled. And this option is only going to be enabled when you are invoicing in flexible billings. So if you don't have that option selected, you won't be able to do that. And that brings us to the end of the demonstration. And I guess, Melanie, if you'd like to open it up for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason. Just as a reminder, if there are any questions, feel free to submit those using the questions pane on the GoToWebinar console, and we will address those with Jason at this time. We don't have anything at the moment. We'll give it another minute or two here and see if anything comes in. Jason, it looks like you've done a very thorough job. We don't have any questions coming in. Just as a reminder, if there are questions that may arise after the presentation has ended, feel free to submit those to an email address, and that address is msdynamicsevents@gmail.com. Again, that's msdynamicsevents@gmail.com. You can always use that if something should arise after the presentation today. But I don't see anything coming in here, Jason, so I appreciate you presenting for us today. We look forward to having you attend our next Dynamics Downloads webinar, which will be on next Wednesday, October 17th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And the topic for that will be Quick Query. What else can I do with it? Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.